Testing, testing. Okay, so this is the first video for the Intro to 3D course at American University and in the game lab. And what we're going to do with these is these will be online sources for students to be able to create the models for the course. And by following these, you'll be able to learn how to use the software for the course, and that way we can focus in-class material on reviewing and troubleshooting and any other more design-centric stuff instead of just software-centric stuff. This way you can also go along at your own pace. So start and stop the video at any time, go back, go forward, etc. So this video, this is the first project, part one of the first project, and in this project we are going to create this box, this crate, and model it, put materials on it using the Quixel Suite 2.0 material generation program, and then we are going to import it into the Unity game engine as you see here. So as you can see, this is going to cover basic modeling, basic texturing, it's going to cover material use, and it's going to cover import-export. So this is a very simple project that will teach you a lot about what's called the 3D art pipeline. Pipeline referring to the overall process from start to finish of creating 3D assets for multimedia projects. So as you can see here, we have this crate, and if I click on it, over on the right side, and I'll explain some of these things later. Right now we just mostly want to look at the crate. So on the right side you're going to see that we have two materials. One is for wood and one is for the metal on the crate. The wood has an albedo texture, which is also called the color map. It has a normal map, which is the map that makes the surface of the object bumpy, and this is going to open up Photoshop so that we can take a look at what a normal map looks like someday. All right, here we go. Slow computers are slow. All right, here we go. So there we are. As you can see, it has this wood grain to it and indents that are on the metal portion. This will all make sense in a little while, but that is what a normal map is, and what it does is it makes this very simple box object have surface detail without having to actually model all the little wood grains and things like that. So as you can see, if I turn off so this is probably better. So if I change the value of the metal normal map to 0, you see these surface details go away, but if I change it back to 1, they reappear. So that is not modeled in, that is a result of this texture map we create. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to cover, is we're going to cover how to make this thing and then how to make it look really cool. So today I'm going to be using a 3D modeling package called Blender. I like Blender for a number of reasons. It's free. That's probably the #1 reason. It gives you really anything you want in terms of features for game development or for other types of multimedia projects. Several films have been made with Blender, including some pretty noteworthy ones. The Secret of the Kells is a big one. That was animated using Blender, and it was nominated for an Academy Award and things like that. So I'm going to be using Blender today. It's also, for the game developers, it's a very indie-friendly, not only because of cost, but also because it has a lot of features that you would see in other pieces of software that are very expensive, like sculpting and things like that. So let me open. File. That's weird. Course materials, all tutorial files. Okay, here we go. Aha. So this is actually what the model for the crate looks like. This is a very simple 3D model. So that is what you see here in Unity, just with textures. So we won't be creating anything too crazy, and this will walk you through some of the basics of Blender. Yes, I want to quit. All right, so let's get started. The way Blender works, and part of the reason that a lot of people have trouble with it, is that it is made to use one hand on the keyboard and one hand on the mouse. The reason people have a lot of trouble with this is that 3D artists are often very used to having things in clickable menus. Maya, for example, uses a lot of menus. It lets you hold down a mouse button and click from sort of a rotary menu of options. Blender puts all of its options into the keyboard. So if you can get used to its keyboard shortcuts, then you will be able to get used to working in Blender, and you'll find that it's actually very fast. So a quick trip around the software. On the left side, you have your tools window, and it has a number of different tabs. So if you do absolutely love mouse input options, this is where you want to go. So translate. So if I right click, that's the other thing people have a lot of trouble with. Blender uses right click to select things, but I'll just say click because there is an option to change that, and that's one of the things I can cover outside of these videos. But so if I right click, or if I click this to select it, and I click translate, okay, so there's translate, rotate, scale. Those are the three basic tools of 3D art. Now, if you want to do those with your keyboard shortcuts, translate is G for grab. Now you notice that whenever you activate one of these tools, it's going to do it based on what the viewport you're viewing it through. Now, normally that's not a problem. If I'm, this is the right view over here on the right side, if I click G, it moves it around based on that viewpoint. But if I am looking at it from a 3D view, you can see you're going to move it in weird directions. So I recommend trying to either move it only in these flat orthogonal views, or if I click G and for say I want to move it along its x-axis, I tap the X key, then it'll stay along the x-axis only. Same thing with Z, which is up and down in Blender, or Y, forward and back. So that's how basically you move things around. The same applies to if I hit the R key for rotate. See, again, it rotates it according to the viewport that I have my mouse hovered over. But if I click the X button, then it constrains it around different axes. And you'll get used to these as you work. And then likewise, S for scale, scales all at once, up and down on the Z-axis, X-axis, Y-axis. So, just to review, your basic functions for manipulating 3D objects are translate, which is in Blender the G key. Think of it this way: you are grabbing and moving. The reason it's not called move is that in 3D, you're translating its position along a 3D coordinate system. Rotate R, scale S. So that should be pretty simple to remember. Now, the other thing we want to know, and these are just some basics, we'll dive into a little more. The other big thing you want to know is that in Blender, you work with two different modes. One mode, well, there's other modes, but for right now, two different modes. And most of the time you use Blender, it's just these two modes. This mode is object mode, which means that you are moving and manipulating objects. So here, if I zoom out a little bit, you'll see this object, for example, this is the camera object. This is what you would use to render, and we can go into that in future videos. And this is the point light, which is just a source of lighting for the scene. It gives you this by default. But those are objects we can move around. Now, if you actually want to modify a 3D object, then we are going to hit the Tab key. Now you can see the different, the model should look a little bit different. The reason is now we can manipulate the sub-portions of the model. Now, every 3D model has different bits of geometry that make it up. If I hit this, if I hit Control and Tab, I can bring them up. The first is Vertex. So every 3D object, the lowest or the most base element you can manipulate is the vertex. So think of high school geometry. You're looking at, you're talking about points in a coordinate system. A bunch of points lined up together equals a line, and several lines create a polygon. That's what we have here. So we can manipulate vertices. So like, I have snap-on. Why do I have snap-on? So like in object mode, we can select by clicking on them one of these vertices and move it around. Now, right now, it's a pretty abstract concept, but believe me, when you are shaping more complex objects, this will come in pretty handy. Then if we hit Control Tab again, we can go to Edge, which lets us manipulate entire sides or entire edges of the model. And then if we hit Control Tab again, we can select faces and manipulate whole faces. The other thing we can do, so let me quickly create another object. We can hit the L key, and that selects entire entities. Now, what do I mean by entity? So if I go back into object mode, so I created another box, but I created the box while I was in edit mode. What does that mean? That means that if I select, if I'm in object mode, which is where you move entire objects around, and not just the parts of objects like their vertices, their faces, etc. If I click on this, we're going to see that there are outlines around both boxes. Now, why is that? The best way to think about how geometry works in Blender is that an object is a container. And based on how you move and manipulate objects, you are creating, when you go into edit mode, it's like you're going inside the container. And now, in this container, there are two entities. We'll call them meshes. So there are two box meshes inside the container. Likewise, if I hit Shift and A, I'm going to make a monkey. So I just added a monkey to the container. But if I go back and just look at the container itself, now I see the container has highlighted two boxes and the monkey head. If I go hit Tab to go into edit mode, which is going inside the container, now I can manipulate any part of any of these. That's usually actually a pretty inefficient way of working. There are times when you'll want to use that, but right now we really don't want to mess with that. So let's L, 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 L. I'm going to hit the X button, X key, to delete, and I'm going to delete vertices because that's the nuclear option. And now we just have a box again. So those are just some simple elements of Blender. The other thing I should show you beyond just these general simple logic of 3D elements is the way to do what I'm doing right now. If you hold down your middle mouse button and move your mouse around, that's how this is called orbit. Now, this is how you change your view of your object. You don't want to go in and rotate your object around with the R button. That will actually rotate and change the orientation of the model. This is if you are just taking the viewport and, it's like you're moving. Let's say you have this on a table and you started walking around the table, and then maybe you duck a little bit to look at the object, but you're still keeping your eyes on the object. That's what you want to do. You want to use this orbit, which again, middle mouse button or mouse wheel, hold it down and move it around. Mouse wheel up and, zooms in and out, using it as a wheel. And then Shift and middle mouse button, holding it down, pans like this. And pan is useful for when you have lots of things in a scene and maybe you're making a little movie or composition. So the other thing we want to remember is that how to manipulate the viewport itself. There are a few shortcuts. So instead of being like, oh man, I want to view this thing from the front, and then you kind of awkwardly position and place it, you could do that, or you could hit the 1 key on your number pad. And if you are using a computer that doesn't have a number pad, there is an option. If you drag down this section up here and click this little I and go down to user preferences and then input, scroll down a little bit down to this emulate numpad option, that will turn the row of number keys at the top of the keyboard into these view keys. Otherwise, if you have a number pad, you don't need to worry about that. If you don't, though, use this option that is, again, in user preferences. Every little window has this little drop down. So user preferences, input, scroll down a bit, and you get emulate numpad. That's how you get these shortcuts on a computer without a number pad like a Mac. So again, if I rotate around, but I hit 1 on the number pad, there we go, we're back to the front view. 3 is right. You also see the name of the view that you're using in the upper left-hand corner of each of these windows. So That's right. 7 is top. And then 5 turns on perspective. So you see how this looks as though the lines are moving towards a vanishing point now. That's how you turn perspective on and off, is the 5 key. Let's say you want to go to the back, hit Control and 1. Now you have back. Control and 3 is left. Control and 7 is bottom. And then 8 rotates around this way. 2 does the opposite. 4 does that. 6 does that. What does 9 do? I actually have no idea what 9 does. It just kind of flips it around, I think. And then 0 on the number key, or numpad, or if you have emulate numpad activated, whichever way, 0 takes you into the camera view. So remember that this guy here, our camera, that's how you look through the cameras with 0. And then if you move the camera around, you change the view of the camera. But we don't worry about the camera right now. All right, so and if you're just opening Blender for the first time and you're like, how did you get this cool split screen? Because usually Blender gives you this as a default. Usually Blender looks like that by default. What you're going to do to change from this is up in the upper right hand corner. So Blender has these things called editors. So by default, it's going to give you up here is an info editor. The big editor in the middle is the 3D view editor. The one on the bottom is the timeline editor. This one over here is the properties editor. You never want to get rid of that one. You always want to have that open. This one is called the outliner editor, which is little more than a list of all the objects in the scene, which can be very handy to have on hand. And then this tool options here, this is a element of the 3D view editor. You toggle it on and off with the T key. So to get the spiffy 2 viewport view, I'm going to go into the upper right hand corner of the 3D view editor, or the 3D editor, apologies. Is it 3D view? Yeah, it is 3D view. The 3D view editor, and you're going to see this little hatched area above a plus sign. The plus sign, don't worry about the plus sign, but you see this little hatched area up here. My cursor turns into a crosshair. When it turns into a crosshair, left click and drag it out, and you'll get another viewport. If you do end up getting yourself into a situation where you have a bunch of this junk, which a lot of people do when they're getting used to this, not a big deal, go back into the upper right hand corner of one of your editor windows that you've made, hold down the left mouse button, and then move your mouse into a nearby viewport, and you'll see it go dark and get this arrow in it. Release it and it'll merge the two. So if you do end up getting yourself into trouble, that's how to fix it. So once you have just 2 editors here, use the 5 key on the keyboard to turn off perspective on both. Make one of, I like to do this way. You're free to do whatever you want. I like to have a right view and a front view. That's just me. The other thing I should cover is this crosshair thing here that I'm clicking around with the left mouse button. This is called the 3D cursor. Now it has a lot of more advanced uses that would not make any sense if this is your first foray into Blender. So we'll cover them as they're useful in these videos. However, the long story short, the way that the basic thing you need to know is if I hit the Shift and A key combination, I get this add menu. So again, let's add our friend, Suzanne the monkey. There's Suzanne. But you see that she popped up on the 3D cursor. that's the most basic, obvious use of the 3D cursor, is placing new objects. So, that's what that does. Now, notice that I created Suzanne in object mode. So 2 things. 1, the add menu is much more full-featured than it was before. It includes not only meshes, which are 3D objects, but also lots of other kinds of objects that, frankly, we'll never even worry about, like NURBS. But, I can make armatures, I can make new cameras, I can add new lights, things like that. So that's what happens when you add an object in object mode. The other thing you'll notice is that these are different objects, i.e. they're different quote-unquote containers, if this makes sense at all. So if I go over to my outliner, which is, again, that list of objects in the scene, cube only has cube in it. Suzanne only has Suzanne in it. So these containers only contain one thing, as opposed to before when we had the object that had 2 cubes and a monkey in it. All right, so I'm going to hit X to delete the Suzanne object because we're not going to worry about that right now. Maybe we'll see Suzanne later. All right, so right now, to finish off this session, we've gone over some basics, but I'm going to quickly create the model for our cool 3D box. So 2 reasons why we want to create an object like this. One is that it's very simple. It's a crate. There's nothing more beyond that to it. It's a box. This will show you some basic modeling elements. It'll show you some basic texturing elements, and it's also going to it's a very standard 3D object in a lot of games and other types of media. It's just a good, safe background option when you're out of ideas. Fill it with crates. So how do we turn that crate, this cube, into that crate? All right, so I'm going to select my cube, hit Tab to go into edit mode, and I want to have my front and side views. So right now I'm in face select mode. It actually doesn't matter what selection mode you're in. Just don't do what I almost did and grab the objects. FYI, if you do find yourself where you've selected something but you've held down the mouse button a little too long, hit escape and you'll get out of that. Also, if you did do something like this and you actually made a change, don't forget our old friend Control Z, which lets you undo everything. Everything is undoable, so don't be afraid to get your hands dirty with 3D. So I'm going to have my front and my side. The other thing we want to use, and this will be very useful for what we're about to do, but if I hit the Z key while I'm in edit mode, I go into wireframe mode, which lets me see through objects. This is handy for both seeing inside the geometry, which we will want to be able to do, but also being able to select what are called back faces. There is a select back face option, but I don't recall it off the top of my head. And truthfully, I usually just use the wireframe anyway. So Z for wireframe, very helpful. Once we have textures, we can also look at a couple different view options. I should mention as well that edit mode, edit mode and object mode are at the bottom of the 3D view. When you're at the bottom of the 3D view, there's these little drop downs down here. You can go into edit and object mode through that. Shading mode, so solid, there's texture, there's wireframe, so this replaces Z, this replaces tab. And then when you're in edit mode, you see down here at the bottom of the screen, there's your vertex, edge, and face select buttons as well. So you don't have to rely on Control and Tab. But Control and Tab is nice. Shortcuts help us move fast. So that's how to do that. So again, I'm going to go into front and side. Now I don't necessarily care about having anything selected. I will, I guess I don't really need to be in wireframe mode yet. But what I will do is, while I'm in edit mode, I will hit the W key. W brings up a menu called Specials, and this is going to include a lot of functions that are going to be very handy for 3D modeling. We're going to go through what they do context sensitive. I'm not going to go through all of them right now. The one that we do care about, actually, I'm a liar. I'm a pretty rotten liar, and the thing I want is not in there. But I know that exists because it's important. I'm actually going to hit, sorry about that, Control and R. So what is this pink line that's now appeared? This is called loop cut. So basically this is going to make a big chunk. This is going to create a whole new set of edges and vertices around the whole 3D object. So it's as though you're cutting the geometry and creating new called topology. So topology is the wireframe. So we're creating new wires in our wireframe. So what this pink line, it's basically the computer asking you, where do you want to cut the model? So it's giving us either go vertically or horizontally. The cool thing about this function, before you click anything, is you push up on your mouse wheel, you can add cuts. So I can go simply into infinity and take this highest polygon cube ever, which makes no sense when we're not going to do it. So I'm going to mouse wheel down until the point when I have. So for those who are using this for the first time, you go near one of the sides, and that's how these things. But I'm going to make 2 cuts. Okay, so once I've done that, now it actually lets me shift them around, which I don't escape because I want them to be nice and centered. But done that, I'm going to hit S key, and I'm hovering over the front orthogonal view, by the way. I'm going to hit the S key, and the X key will let me scale this outward widely, and we'll drop it. Okay, so I've scaled to this point along the x-axis, and I'm going to stop around there and then click my left mouse button. Alright, so what do I do? Now we have these 2 sets of polygons. So if I go into face select mode, now there's all these new faces here. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing, loop cut, rotate a little bit up on my mouse wheel to get 2 cuts along the side here, click, escape, scale. This time I'm going to scale along the Z, and we want them to be roughly square. It's only create, doesn't need to be perfect. This is also potentially your first time 3D modeling, so don't worry about it. 3D modeling requires lots of practice, and that's why we are working with something simple. We'll go into more challenging stuff soon. Alright, so now, okay, so we've got the beginning of this indentation along the one side, but you don't see it on the other side. So we're going to go into our right viewport here. So all you need to do is hover your mouse over this. Now we're going to do another loop cut. Okay, roll up to get 2, click, escape, scale, S, along the y-axis this time. And so I should mention something about scaling and rotating. So when you scale and rotate objects, let me go back into object mode. You don't have to go into object mode. But if I'm very close to the center of an object and I hit something like rotate, if I'm very close to the center of an object, the smallest mouse movement have, because it all does it relative to the mouse position, the smallest mouse movement is going to make a very severe impact. A little farther out, you can more finely tune the rotation. So keep that in mind when you are doing some operations like scaling and rotating and things like that. You want to make sure that you have the most amount of control. So when you are scaling things, move your mouse back before you're hitting the S key. All right, so if I orbit around my cube, right, I'm checking that I have all of my sides with the appropriate setup, which I do. Good. All right, now I'm going to go back to my front view, and now I'm going to activate my wireframe in at least one of my views. All right, so now, and I'm going to go into face select mode. All right, see? So I'm going to select one of my faces, go back into front view. All right, so now I need to make the indentations because we want there to be a frame to this crate and we want there to be like the box part. So the frame part's going to be metal, the box part's going to be wood. So how do we make this kind of indentation? If I were to say, take this and turn it inward, this is what would happen. Now, I can actually cool. That's the option for it more of as a divot than as a actual indentation, but that's not what we're going for. So moving isn't the answer. I'm going to Control Z. Remember, Control Z is your friend. Everything is undoable. When you start to see things careen out of control, always undo. So I'm going to go into wireframe again. So we want to indent this, but we don't want it to be have one orthogonal view and one preview. So you can see what I'm about to do. So I'm going to use a command called extrude, and that's going to help me. It helps add geometry, but it also helps you create indentations and things that stick out. Like when you're making a 3D character, you have some polygons at base of the arm, and you'd extrude those, and that's how you'd create an arm. So here we're going to hit E for extrude, and it'll automatically do it along the Z-axis for us if you've selected the top. Basically, it is automatically going to make it go 90 degrees from the polygon you started the extrusion from. So I'm going to go about halfway down this square here and click left mouse button. All right, so you see the right view here how now we have the like a area and the inside box area. Now we want to do that with all of our box pieces. So let me do that with my front. I'm going to switch this to right view, extrude. So we want to do this on the front view. Basically what I'm doing is I'm picking a side of the box in this 3D mode, and I'm using the other vert to extrude. I want to have a view such that the side I'm extruding appears as a flat line here. If see it like this, I'm not going to have any control. But if I use this and I see the flat line, that means that I'm staring at the side of the point that I'm extruding, and I'll actually be able to control how I move this around. So there we go. All right. Okay, so see again, I'm staring straight at the side. I want to extrude, I want to stare at it from the side, so I'm going to hit 3 again. All right, there we go. Extrude. Boom. Bottom's done. All right, so you see why already having multiple viewports open is really wide, because you can you can have one open in a 3D view, and then you can have one in called an orthogonal view, which means a flat view, and then that lets you see what you're doing from multiple angles. All right, so now we have the base of our box. All right, we're done, right? No. We want to add, now, don't get me wrong, this is a fine box, and we can put this in a game and put a nice texture on it, and it would be great. But the thing we want to do to this to make it really cool, if we look back at this box, you notice that its sides aren't sharp. Now, sometimes there are little things in game engines that can smooth out these sides, but we're going to model this in. And the reason we want to do that, both for aesthetic, there we go. We want to do this both for aesthetic purposes and because this will show you another few functions of Blender that you'll want to know about. So I'm going to have our box in this state. I'm going to go to Edge Select mode. And so I want to select multiple edges at once. It can get kind of tedious selecting them one at a time. So to select multiple objects at once, you hold the Shift key and click Objects. So I can start to shift select all these edges. And I want to shift select the edges on these corners of the frame, because we want the metal part of the frame to be, well, we're going to do what's called bevel on them. The other thing we can do is if we shift and hit Alt, then we'll do what's called a loop select. Now the shift actually is just your average, let me hit A and unselect. By the way, A is select all and deselect all. But if I hit Alt and click on something, it's called loop select. It's very interesting here, but because of the way the geometry is working, but normally on pieces of other objects, it would select the entire loop of geometry. Here it's just selecting this edge, this series of edges. So if we combine Shift for multiple select, but Alt for loop select, now you can see where you can select a lot of these loops all at one time and save yourself a lot of headache of selecting each individual edge one at a time. If you're starting to think, wow, 3D modeling is actually a little tedious, it is in a lot of ways. There's a lot of little tedious steps you have to take. And trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. All right, so I want to make sure that I have the interior and the exterior of every side, which I do. All right, now that I have all these selected, I'm going to go over to the right side of the screen, into the properties window. Now, this contains a bunch of, there are a lot of buttons up at the top here. These are all called contexts. Quick overview of some of the contexts. We're going to go through these as we encounter them, so don't worry about missing one. But this, by default, it's on this little camera context, and the purpose of the little camera is as a, that's the render context. So this is how we are going to render pictures and video. Again, we're not going to deal with that right now. One thing we do care about, if we go down in the render context and we see frame rate, it says 24 FPS. For filmmakers, that's where you want your frames per second for the most, usually, sometimes. Depending, if you're making, a Pixar style animation, usually things like that are at 24 frames per second. But a lot of video editors also work in 30 frames per second, which is what I usually go for. So 30 frames per second. The reason I highlight this is because, especially for things like this, where part of the pipeline will be exporting to a game engine like the Unity game engine, game engines like to run in 30 frames per second as their default speed. So if you don't run it at 30 frames per second, you left it as 24, and then you exported this model for use in the game engine, you'd actually make your game run slower, not because the game is suddenly working at 24 frames per second, but because the model is set up to work at a different frame rate than the game engine. So FYI, if you're working in a game engine, always make sure you're at 30 frames per second. So again, there's a few other contexts. The ones that we care about right now is this one that looks like a wrench. So I click that one, and it adds what's called a modifier. Modifiers do a lot of different, there it went. They do a lot of different things. And again, we'll go over them throughout the course. Context sensitive, we'll use them as we need them, because there's a lot of stuff that you will never need, depending on what your field is. So right now, though, we care about this one called Bevel. So we're going to go to the Bevel. So we click that, and what does it do? It's a little hard to see because of the way it displays it, but long story short, it has taken those edges that we've highlighted, and it has split them into multiple edges. So right now it's hard to see because it's treating it as a special modifier. So you're still able to select these edges as they were single edges, but you can see these shadows. It's this sort of effect where it's rendering them as multiple edges, as though we've sanded off the edges of this box and made it smoother. This is a little more severe than I would like, so I'm going to go into my properties context, and now I have options for my bevel modifier, one of which is width. So one thing that you're going to discover about, what does that do? 0.5. Hello, you're supposed to... Why is it not? Okay, so can change the amount of bevel, but we only want to have one segment. I don't understand why it's not. Oh, I see. Aha, that's why. Okay, so I screwed something up. I was trying to modify. No, now it's working. Okay, well, I went into edit mode and I started tweaking the numbers in edit mode or in object mode, and then it worked. So I'm going to mess with the width entry, and I did that in object mode. I messed with the width entry in object mode, and that lets me modify how big the bevel is. So I've settled on 0.025. I like it here. You may like it bigger or smaller, but I like it here. And so what I can do now is if I click this apply button, so just to, before we hit apply, I selected all these, I added a bevel modifier, I went into object mode, I changed its width to 0.025. We have this outcome, and now I'm going to hit the apply button. Now what does that do? Now these bevels that we made are actual geometry, so we could move them around as actual geometry. So now we have a cube like the one that we saw in 3D, or in Unity. Of course it's in 3D. So two more things for this video, now that we have this cube. This looks a little fragmenty. What's a better way to say this? It looks a little, it looks very faceted. So there's very harsh changes of shading from one polygon to another. We can smooth that out. The way to do that is I'm going to select these faces, these innermost faces, all of them, and then I'm going to go down to the bottom of the 3D view window and click select, and I'm going to hit inverse, which the shortcut for is Control and I, and it'll select that. So if I go into the left-hand tools window, which again, if you don't have this, you turn this on and off with the T key for tools. If I go down to the shading and UVs tab and I click faces smooth, now it's smooth except for these interior faces, which we wouldn't want smooth, but that looks a little better. This actually did change a setting of the object itself. It changed how it renders on the screen, which means that if you had not taken this step and put it into Unity, you'd have this similar faceted look as we had before we added this setting, which is not, for something like this where we want to have smooth, sort of beaten up metal, it's not ideal. So we've just made it a little more visually interesting. The other thing we want to do is, the way that the bevel modifier works is we get these inner bevels. I'm not really a big fan of these, but that's just how the algorithm works. We want there to be a harsher, more abrupt transition between the metal frame and the wood. We don't want it to be that, it's sort of like gracefully transitions from one material to another, because the wood box is supposed to just be inside the metal frame. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go into an orthogonal view. I'm going to select this inside of the box face, and then I'm just going to scale it. So that it's about there. So what I did is I scaled it so that it's, you don't see the interface in the front here. And then the other thing I can do is G, Y, move it forward a little bit. So you see I'm just moving it and scaling it so that the interfaces, they're still there and they need to be there, but you're not really going to notice them, and they will actually, you know, that'll create the effect of, you know, these being two distinctly different materials. So we can do that for each side. Again, this is just like some small tweaking. It's not a big deal, but you can see what I'm doing. You know, these are just some of the things you do when you 3D model, is you work on little details like this, adjusting and getting them right so that they create the look you want. Oops. I normally won't edit in this way on these videos, but I want you all to see the general workflow without the slowness of walking through it. All right, so once I've done that to all my sides, this is what I have. So we will go to File, Save As, and we'll give it a name like Crate01, and that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this. This was the 3D modeling step 1 video for the Introduction to 3D Modeling course at the AU Game Lab. Thank you very much. Next up, we will work on we will begin the texturing process.